Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction, and thank you guys for coming. See, we've got a full house, which is amazing. My name is Omaru. As Christopher said, I'm going to talk to you today about just APIs in the last 12 to 18 months. As you know, the world went into a global lockdown. A lot of physical interactions were restricted, in some cases halted, which meant that we had to redo the things that we would typically do through physical interactions by digital means. So before I go further, just a little bit about myself. I've been in cybersecurity and AI for the last 12 years. I hold a PhD in applied artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. I've worked in Botswana, Singapore, and Australia. I advise a number of companies in Australia and Singapore in cybersecurity. And I also sit on the board of Bendigo Bank in Baniyang, which is in Ballarat. So it's great to be here. My talk today is going to be quite simple, very basic. I'm going to talk about how the pandemic contributed and drove this massive shift from doing things primarily physically to a more digital way of service provision. We'll drill deep into what the drivers for that growth were in terms of the usage of APIs and the platforms. And then at the heart of all of that, security became, the biggest risk in any digital platformization, in any API digital transformation strategy. And then we'll sample some key events within the API space, particularly focusing on security in terms of regulation. We've seen some countries introduce new regulations. We'll talk about some massive investments in the space and also some innovations that have happened in that space as well. So the first thing I wanted to start with is this. This is a screenshot of a report from a McKinsey 2022 report talking about how through the pandemic, a lot of the banks in Europe, America, and Asia Pac closed 9% of their branches. And the reason for the closure of the branches was because they saw a big drop in the number of foot traffic going into the branches. And again, the number one reason for that was the pandemic, right? When people couldn't go to the branches, some of them got used to using their apps. The ones that were already using the apps decided that they would never go back to the branches. There's also a report from the Retail Association of Australia that spoke about how the two of the biggest retailers in Australia relooked their strategy. Before the pandemic, the sales from retail was 65% foot traffic. So a lot of the stuff that you buy retail was 65% of that was earned from people coming into the store and buying it. After the pandemic, that dropped to 55, so a 10% drop in foot traffic. And what that meant for those companies was, looking at ways to ramp up that digital channel, right? And that was primarily done via API-powered platforms. So in 2021, we saw globally that $2.27 trillion was spent in digitization programs or projects. And this ranged from anything from open banking, fintech solutions that made banking and money transfer and retail commerce easier, digital transformation projects. I know that in Australia, through some of the interactions with our partners, almost every major company is doing digital transformation, and also platformization. A lot of businesses are also looking to innovate some of their service provisions. And all of this is primarily powered through APIs. APIs make it easier to platformize. APIs make it easier for a retail bank customer to move from one bank to the other almost instantly, right? So we've seen APIs really come to the forefront to the point that for the first time in a long time, $2.27 trillion was spent in projects that had to do with APIs. The caveat to that, however, is that security became, the biggest enabler to all of that. As traffic in APIs increased by 141%, the number of attempts to compromise those API platforms increased almost double, right? We've seen a lot of, I'd call them innovative ways to compromise API systems, but really what's happening here is you could build an API-powered platform, but it needs to have a robust security. And because of that, because of the need to have a secure API-powered platform, we're seeing a rise in investments in API security. We're seeing, as I said earlier, countries introducing regulation, right? We're seeing a number of new innovative companies pop up to do one thing or the other in terms of API security. So I'll spend the rest of the time now just talking about what's happened from an investment perspective, from a regulation perspective, and also on the innovation part. In terms of regulation, Singapore became one of the first countries to specifically regulate API security. In 2021, through their TRM, Technical Risk Management, they introduced API security monitoring guidelines. And for those of you who don't know, MAS is the Monetary Authority of Singapore. This is equivalent to the Reserve Bank of Australia, so the central bank and also the regulator for financial services. Following that, Europe, I know that a number of countries also then increased focus on security within the API standards, right? So that was driven by the fact that a lot of companies moved to digital channels, driven by the fact that the traditional way of doing things, which is physical interactions, dropped significantly. And then from an investments perspective, we saw for the first time in 2021 an API security company become a unicorn. When I started Aiculus in 2017, API security had always been looked at as an add-on. You'd have your API gateway, and security becomes an add-on to that. And so, through the channels of starting a company, you fundraise and you do all of these things. And the sentiment from a lot of investors was that API security on its own could never get any bigger. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction. There wasn't a lot of confidence in API security as a standalone service offering. But we didn't know the pandemic was going to happen, and now we're seeing a company that purely specializes in API security valued at $1 billion, which is a big deal. In the same year alone, a research company called Woodside Capital did some research and found out that for 2021, around $527 million had been poured into API security. Again, I think this was the biggest investment in any part of cybersecurity, which is, nobody could have predicted this. And then from an innovation perspective, what all this meant is that the space became competitive, but also it became very active. You're starting to see companies, want API security product offerings. You're seeing companies wanting to add API security standards to their existing API standards. But also one of the things we're seeing is organizations are still looking for, a cost-effective solution. A lot of API security products are very, very expensive, not cheap at all. And part of the reason for that is to provide API security monitoring, API security vetting, using what everybody uses now, which is your traditional cloud infrastructure, hosting and service provision, is costly. So the price is going to have to cover the cost to provide that service, as well as a markup. So I think in terms of innovation, we're still seeing both organizations looking for a way to secure their API channels in a way that doesn't really kill their business model. Startups, especially in medium and small to medium companies, are still not finding it worthwhile to invest in API security, primarily because of cost, right? And also at the bottom of that pyramid, we're seeing investors still actively looking for an innovative solution. Innovative in the sense that it's cost effective. It's something that customers are willing to pay for, and they're seeing value for it. So, that's all I had. And what I wanted to say here is the pandemic has really, really helped inject this, vibrancy into API security. But that has come at a cost of, we're seeing, when I started in 2017, when I started Aiculus, there were 4 API security companies that I was aware of. The following year, one of them got acquired, which was, good news for us. But now, if you just Google API security, there'd be, a lot that pop through. And this is partly what's driven that explosion in API security. I don't think it's going to go away. I think we'll see a lot of businesses continue to look for, innovative products that really secure their API platforms, their API service offerings. So that's all I had. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to start with the question.
Sure.
And could I ask you to repeat the question for people who are remote?
Of course.
I'm a managed services person.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned on your last slide that some organisations are struggling with the balance of how to invest in security whilst we have so much pressure to release new products to market. Mm-hmm. Can you give any advice for customers struggling with that balance?
Yeah. So the question is, how can organizations balance, pushing product on a continuous manner, but also making sure that those products are secured, investing in API security, right? My advice would be look for products that, meet you halfway in terms of cost, products that are light. You will find that, like I said, there's a lot of products out there that offer API security, but the deployment, the cost to provide that product, and also what techniques are being used, right? API security started primarily from authentication and authorization, right? The traditional approach was to secure an API, you'd have to vet the authenticity of the service requester, and also the authorization. Are they requesting what they're meant to be requesting? It's gone far beyond that. In some cases, how far down the API technology stack does that product secure? Some companies concentrate on the perimeter, anti-DDoS, anti-throttling, and things like that. Others look at within the API request, is there a way we can validate whether this is a legitimate API request or not, right? So I would say, talk more to the service provider, to the vendor, understand exactly what value you're getting from your API security. Because some service offerings you can get from your web application firewall, looking for that additional value beyond what you get from your WAF, I think would be worthwhile.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Do you think that with more cloud adoption happening in the world, that there will be maybe narrowing down of security companies that are working in cloud, because the cloud service provider already provides security measures to secure the APIs?
Yeah, look, I think as part of the competition that's happening, you're going to get cloud providers get into API security. You're going to get firewall companies get into API security. And consequently, yes, there will be some kind of morphing into a more modular approach. I think so. But I think before that happens, it's a very actively evolving space. I think we're talking about API security now, but I think next year or maybe 2 years from now is going to be API security and what else, right? And I think whoever can continue to adapt and be able to take the customer on a, a more, I guess, more, what do you call it? End-to-end, right? That end-to-end service provision, I think that's who might be left standing at the end. Thank you for the question. Any other question?
I'll throw you another one then.
Sure.
What are you doing to stay innovative in this area?
Oh, thank you. So the question is, what are we as Aiculus doing to stay innovative in the area? A number of things. The first is we invest a lot in R&D. I have our, machine learning engineer here. We continue to, because where we differentiate with our competitors is innovation, right? We think we're approaching API security from a very different angle. And so we invest a lot in research and development. We partner with universities, particularly in deep learning. We're also now working in quantum computing, because what we think is going to happen is, given what we're seeing, particularly with financial services, to try and secure API traffic for a bank, you've got to be able to process each incoming request very, very fast. And quantum computing seems like, an area that's going to help with processing power, right? You're going to be able to process whether it's 10 requests in a second, in a way that it doesn't compromise the user experience. So those are some of the things we're looking at. So we're very actively involved in R&D, and we continue to have, a number of ways that we're different to our competitors. Yeah. Thank you so much.